Okay, we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Live from the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and I am continuing on day 7 of the RPG a day exercise for 2017. For those who may be joining me for the first time, this is, of course, the project where it's now in its 4th year, where everyday bloggers or vloggers, I guess, or vloggers will be answering questions that are specific to the RPGs they're playing or they want to play or what they think about them and whatever. Today's question is, what was your most impactful RPG session? And this one has actually proven to be kind of hard to answer because, first off, I guess I should give some context to my answer here. I didn't want to just say, boy, this session was a lot of fun, or boy, people seem to really enjoy this session. The word wasn't, or the way that the question was phrased wasn't, what was the most fun session or what was the most interesting session. The question is what was the most impactful? So I thought about the ways that that could be interpreted, and one of them is impact on the campaign. So I guess one thing I thought of also, it could be impactful in the sense that it could be the impact on you, your relationship with the DM and the players. But that's going to probably delve into the negative. No one's, like, boy, we're much better friends after that session. But you can have friendships that are damaged by by what goes on in a game session. And I don't really want to dwell on that. I've been very, very fortunate. I've really only had one, storming off in a huff session. And that was years and years ago, and with someone who to be honest, it was the second time I'd played with them, and we got at loggerheads over something, and I think it was a miscommunication as to what I was intending to play and what he thought we were going to be playing. So that campaign continued on without him, but I'm not sure there's a lot of productive, or there's not a useful material, I think, or any useful lessons that would come from that. That's just a matter of personalities clashing. And I guess miscommunicated expectations. So what I thought is not between the impact on the relationship with the DM with the players. I thought maybe it would be an impact on how you run the game, or maybe an impact on how the campaign changed or went forward. Or I thought of another example that I'm kind of shoehorning in just because I think it's a good example of where hopefully someone can learn from my mistakes on this, where there was an impact on my willingness to continue running the game. So I'm going to give 3 different examples here that are ways that were sessions that were very impactful on different aspects of this hobby for me. So the first one is going to be about, I brought visual aids again because I like my visual aids, D&D 4th edition. So I had, as I'd mentioned on this channel before, I only have 2 hands. So I didn't bother grabbing the monster manual as well. I ran D&D 4th edition for about 2.5 or 3 years. During the life cycle of the game, we were playing a lot. It really wasn't up until we sort of had dwindled away or stopped playing it by the end of the game's life cycle when they announced D&D Next. But we got a lot of good gameplay out of that game. So one of the sessions, though, when I first started running D&D 4th, is I thought that I would be. I guess let me back up here. For those unfamiliar with the 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, it was a significant departure from the design aesthetic from previous editions. In most editions, first, second, third, AD&D, basic D&D, 5th edition, you can look at a character sheet and get a rough idea, regardless of whatever edition you're familiar with, of what's going on in that character sheet. D&D 4th was a totally different animal. It's a terrific game. I think it's a terrific game. It's just I understand people's complaints that it isn't D&D because it is a very, very different game. One of the ways it significantly differs is the fact that it has a very, very tactical combat system. There's characters have, or their classes have, in addition to specific classes, they have, each of those classes fits into broadly kind of a role that they're supposed to play in the combat, which is taking cues obviously from MMO design. But it's also, I mean, to be honest, kind of how people played the game as before too, with like tanks and clothies and whatever. It just wasn't formalized in the rules the way that it was in 4th edition. I only mention that because that's the proper context to understand this cautionary tale. So what we were doing is we had run a couple other, we had another ongoing campaign with 4th edition at the time. But I decided I wanted to try and shake things up. So we were a different group of friends, and we decided to run something. I wanted to run something that was more old school. So I had, I can't remember what adventure it was, but I had set it in the known world. Actually, no, I know what it was. It was the first adventure in the Scales of War adventure path, something I mentioned on yesterday's, or maybe 2 days ago. I can't remember. In the last couple of days, it's an adventure path that was published through Dungeon Magazine for 4th edition D&D. Anyway, what the old school thing I decided to use was random encounters, because the guys were traveling in the wilderness. I thought it'd be interesting to throw something like this at them, because it feels more like traditional style, where you may be encountering something that's a real pushover, or you may encounter something that's a bit of a out of your class or out of your league. Well, long story short is what I ended up doing is randomly rolling while the guys were sleeping, and one person was keeping watch, and I'm pretty sure it was the clothy who was keeping watch. The guys were set upon by a bunch of spiders, and I think they were trapdoor spiders. I'm not sure. Destiny. They're kind of. I think they were the ones that maybe. It's not facing spiders. Those have been way too high level. But anyway, it was just a small group of giant spiders. Because the players were set, the combat, I guess, was initiated with the players on the, players hadn't had an opportunity to prepare, so they're caught unawares. And that this was actually like I think in terms of difficulty, was an average or slightly more difficult encounter, which would have required the players to have some time to actually be prepared for it. It basically killed 2 or 3 members of the party before really they got a chance to do anything. And then it was really just DM Fiat that allowed them to, I can't remember what they did. They maybe picked up like logs from the fire to try and chase these things off. And then I said, okay, well, they chase off. But yeah, so the things I learned, the impact that had on my understanding of 4th edition D&D was that, was I guess a better appreciation for what the combat encounters required in order for the players to if I was going to spring something like that on the players, it needed to be a lot less tough than what I had set, so that because the players weren't having an opportunity to to fight on equal footing, they didn't have a chance to bring all their different abilities to bear. So that I brought forward. I never made that mistake again. And it also, to be honest, I mean, it's a session that I still have those players mention to me. Oh, is this going to be those spiders again? So I guess it had an impactful relationship on us. And I'm not really a killer DM. I think I'm not even sure if I've ever killed a player character before, to be honest. But that's largely because we don't. I change games quite often, and but I'm not sure I've ever had a player character die. I have to think about that, but I don't think so. So anyway, so that was a bit of an outlier for the players from that. So that's one way that session had an impact on my understanding of that game, and helped me understand how it differed from previous editions. Second thing I want to talk about is another D&D example, actually, more recently, and this is actually my first effort of running 5th edition. So shortly after the Player's Handbook came out, and I think maybe before the DMG came out, or around time, this came out. I think this came out at the same time as the Player's Handbook came out. Hoard of the Dragon Queen. It's the first part of the 2-part series, Rise of, I can't remember what actually the name of the campaign was, but it's Hoard of the Dragon Queen, and the second one is Rise of Tiamat. So the campaign this campaign is a very railroady. I mean, like a lot of published adventures, it's a very railroady thing where like you're going to do this here, and then you travel here and you do this, and you travel here and you do this. So I guess it's actually even more literally a bit of a railroad, because it's a travelogue kind of adventure, but you don't really get a chance to stop and smell the roses all that much. And I guess one thing I should fess up to is that I'm not a huge fan of the Forgotten Realms. It's not like I dislike them. It's just that I don't find them particularly interesting, and I don't find them particularly evocative. They feel very, a lot of the regions feel very samey, because there's not distinct ethnicities for humans. There's not, like the differences in ethnicity in cultures seem to come more from the races, like the non-human races, rather than within the human races. And I'm sure that someone who's more knowledgeable in the Forgotten Realms setting could correct me on this, but just, I've been reading the Forgotten Realms material since the first gray box set, and it's never really clicked with me. But that said, it is popular with a lot of other folks, and it's there is a lot of material for it. So I decided to try running this. My reason I went with a pre-published adventure rather than a custom-made thing is because at the time I wanted to understand how the game ran. I had made my mistakes with 4th edition D&D, so I wanted to give it a chance to see how this would run. And at the time, my intent was just to plow through the levels, boom, 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 boom. We had a timeline set to get the characters up to, I can't remember what level this game gets you to, but by the end of Rise of Tiamat, I think you're like 15th level or something like that. So that was the plan. And of course, I got bored really quickly. The characters were great. The players were really terrific. But the adventure was not, I didn't find it particularly interesting. And this game was coming on the heels of the last campaign we ran, which I'll talk about in a moment, was an Iron Kingdoms game that lasted for about 2.5 years. And that game was a very, very sandboxy game. There was a running plot thread that was going throughout it, but a lot of it was the characters interacting with different things in the environment and different like noble houses and stuff like that. So it had a really rich lived-in feel, and that game really benefited from allowing the players would, get interested in some small thing, like they wanted to set up a tavern, and they would spend a ton of time doing that. So, and that became part of the game, was them managing that and dealing with the issues going on with the people who worked there and so forth. So it was a really personal, sandboxy kind of game with a sort of own overarching story going on as well. And you can contrast that with this, which was just, and I don't mean to fault the designers of the adventure. It's not the greatest of adventures, and it's not, I didn't find it, I don't know. It just really wasn't particularly interesting. But in any event, when we started getting through this, because I was getting bored with it, I was talking to a fellow DM friend who wasn't actually running it, and I kept saying, you know what, I feel like I'm so bored with this. I feel like I just want to blow up the world by just doing like zombie plague. Okay, so you thought this is what you were doing. You thought this was the threat, but here we go. There's a god in this called Miracle, who's the Lord of Bones, who I think at the time was dead, maybe, so the dead god of the dead was dead. But I had this idea to try and reintroduce Miracle and like a miracle plague and stuff like that. And then I decided, well, no, it's not really fair to the players, because this is the game they signed up for, and this is what they were, going to be adventuring through, and blah blah blah. So I sort of shelved that idea, and then we had a session where the guys were hanging out in a tavern, and I had happened to run in the town they were staying in. There was this, in one of the source books, like one of the Forgotten Realms source books, they talked about this. There was a curse that could come on someone if they finished. There was like a there was some like damned company or something, some damned mercenary company that was like an undead threat and whatever. And everyone in this town sang this chant about them, this big song about it, kind of like a song you would sing in rounds, right? And everyone in the town knew that you didn't finish that because you didn't finish the last verse of it because it would curse everyone. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was a cool, evocative thing. So we had a scene earlier on in that session where things went totally sideways. There was a chase that was supposed to happen where they were, someone had stolen something from the tavern they were staying in. So the guys were like, haha, we'll prove ourselves. And then the dice were just completely against them. So it was a total schmozzle. The guy got away, and I think one of the characters ended up throwing up. And so the players were a bit demoralized because they weren't able to actually achieve this very, very simple thing. So I decided to incorporate that. One of the characters was a musically oriented, I think. So he's like, well, I'm going to play a song and try and get everyone going again. And the tavern launch into the songs, and I had the song at hand. So I sort of, went with that. Went through the whole kind of song, and then for the last verse, I let the guy who led the singing make a history check or an in check with like a history skill. And turns out that he knew the whole song. He just didn't know that, because I think he rolled 1 again. He didn't know you're not supposed to sing that last song. So the scene was this whole tavern full of people all singing, blah, 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 this song, banging on tables, chanting and, knocking glasses together and stuff like that. And then it gets to the last verse and everyone stops, and it's just the one character who's still singing. He sings that one verse that you're not supposed to because it curses you. And the whole tavern goes silent. And then slowly people start kind of like either muttering over their drinks or making their way out and whatever. Between that, that's how we ended that session. And then between then and the next session, I thought about it more, and I was like, fuck it, I'll introduce some little neat thing. And it ended up becoming this, I ended up incorporating the idea of this miracle plague through the player. And I can't remember the specifics of it, but I think that he ended up becoming basically the source of this miracle plague. And it was going to be that the guys would have to figure out this was what was going on. Now, the downside was this ended up manifesting in their entire ship ended up getting haunted. This plague spread amongst the ship, so they all went, got sailed from that first place to the next place, and then it ended up being this like haunted ship, which was actually a pretty fun encounter, but it wasn't part of the ongoing adventure. In addition to that, I also introduced a bunch of more advanced in the setting or in the game, I should say, or the campaign. There are different factions, and I ended up introducing a bunch of rules that more structured rules to show how they could gain more favor with those different factions. And I gave specific tangible rewards. So there were things like, guys who were members of the, I think it was the Order of the Gauntlet, could get, an ally who could be like I can't remember, it was like a war horse or a animated suit of armor or stuff like that. And each of the factions had different similar kind of rewards to them. I was stealing ideas from partly from Shadowrun and partly just kind of my own stuff, and adopting the rules that were in the DMG, which by this point had come out. So what ended up happening is I ended up basically introducing 2 main sort of side ways of approaching the campaign. There was, of course, the ongoing threat of Tiamat, which they knew about, and there was the big, the threat of the Dragon Queen, the cult that was, that was going on, and they were to follow that along, they'd have to continue on traveling up north and whatnot. But then they also had this side thing with the Miracle Plague going on. And then I also introduced this mini game where, not mini game, but I mean this other sort of more sandboxy element where the players could just try and gain faction or gain what do you call it? Gain influence with these different factions and gain access to new and cool shit. And the factions didn't necessarily align with what with just thwarting the queen. So the players, I think, got a little, not confused, but I mean, the players were struggling to try and figure out what to do with this. And in retrospect, had I just said, you know what, I'm going to let you do whatever you want. You can pursue the Dragon Queen stuff. You can pursue your own interests in this town by, working with your factions. You can try and figure out what's going on with this Miracle Plague. That probably would have been a way to handle it. But what I sort of felt from that was that the players were a bit at a loss as to what to actually do. I mean, I think that on a metagame context, they thought the game was about this, and then I ended up changing sort of ships midstream and making it about something else. And I don't think if I hadn't been expressly clear from the get-go as to like this is what the game is about, then I think I wouldn't have been as frustrated with it. Then I guess like there were some other things going on in the background. We have some players who just suddenly, who weren't showing up because their real lives were getting busy. It wasn't that they weren't interested in the game. It's just that, one of our friends had who's playing the game just had a new child. So, managing 3 kids at home and work when your wife works as well was tricky for him to actually make the session. So, as a result of that, we ended up setting this game aside, and then we played. Actually, we went into a bunch of mini games as well. I ran a bunch of war story sessions using a bunch of things, and then we ended up drifting into something else. And I think we ended up landing on Star Wars. Actually, I think that was the next game that we ended up running. Maybe Dragon Age came after that, but in any event, so the way that was impactful for me is just the session where I introduced Miracle. And I introduced those, and I think it was around the same time I introduced the rules for the factions. That session really derailed the story the players thought that they were following. And I think I mean, honestly, if I had to do it again, I could have handled it a lot better in terms of making the campaign just be about whatever the players wanted to do, and then have the consequences would come down the road. Yeah, that had a huge impact on the momentum of that game, because instead of following this urgent thrust of got to stop the Dragon Queen, it became a distracting element. And I mean, the game is about, what I guess like a campaign is always going to be whatever is actually happening at the table. So I mean, there would have been nothing wrong had I just sort of rejigged things and whatnot. But I felt like because I was getting bored of running just the adventure as written, I threw some other stuff in there, and that I felt derailed the momentum of what should have felt like an urgent threat against the a powerful evil. So anyway, so that was a really impactful session. Final one I'll mention is in relation to the impact of the players. So impact on the players in a campaign. And for this one, I'm just going to talk about the Iron Kingdoms RPG campaign that I ran. As I mentioned a little bit ago, the game was set up as a sandbox. The players I had in the game, one of them was really, he loves elves. He always loves, I think he plays an elf in any game that he has an opportunity to play an elf in. And the Iron Kingdoms elves are really a really interesting kind of dying race. So there's a cool, doomed, fatalism, I guess, about them. And he really liked that, and he ended up playing a character who was what's called a seeker, a character who kind of is going out and trying to find secrets about the elven past to try and hopefully unlock some solution to the problem the elves are having. And it's a secret of the campaign, but it's not really a secret to anyone's game, so I don't feel like I'm giving too much away in terms of spoilers here. But what happened is that the elves were, their souls weren't reincarnating properly. They're in the story, or in the setting, their gods were, because of a catastrophic accident, millennia ago, the elven gods came from kind of like the overworld through this gate. The elves thought it would be clever to build this giant gate to actually meet God, right? And then for some reason or another, as the gods sort of stepped through, there was a catastrophic failure which caused untold damage. I mean, annihilated the elven civilization, trapped the gods on the material world, and wreaked horrible changes to the world itself. Because they were trapped in the world, the gods slowly kind of withered and lost their power and whatnot, to the point where there's only one god that they know of. So there's two gods in the campaign setting, but that are still left for sure. One god that is sort of sleeping in the elven homeland, and one that was sort of with the winter elves up in the north, the Nis. But anyway, I mentioned that only as context because the character was playing a character or an elf who was very much trying to recapture this, not recapture, but to save his people by finding about ancient secrets. It also meant that, every elven life that was lost, or Iosan life that was lost, Iosan were that kind of elf. It was a huge loss for the race as a whole, because it meant that their souls wouldn't reincarnate. They would just be lost somehow. And yeah, so that was the character. The campaign itself was set up in as a sandbox setting. One of my other players in it was a huge Game of Thrones fan, so I really wanted to give him a bunch of different noble houses to play off against. So what I did is I set the basic conceit of the campaign was the characters all sort of met through happenstance around this map. There was an ancient map of this one duchy in northern Lale, which is sort of this kingdom that is just east of a place called Khador. Khador is kind of like an ersatz Russia. Anyway, in northwestern Lael, there's a land that sort of has this neat, you know, Russian kind of Eastern European feel to it. So I created this duchy, or this place called Blackacre, and Blackacre itself was actually a nod to another friend. Blackacre is in law school textbooks, those dealing with property law. There is a place called Blackacre that is always routinely referred to as like the example. The example when you're dealing with real estate and whatever else is Blackacre. A friend of mine he loved that, so he kept calling his characters in different things Blackacre. He thought it was funny in different role-playing games in World of Warcraft and whatnot. So it was expected he was going to play in that campaign too. So I decided to call the campaign setting Blackacre because I thought it'd be funny little, you know, a funny little nod for his other characters. So anyway, they were going to go to the Duchy of Blackacre. There was this map that they all had sort of become involved with, which was a specifically illuminated map that, you know, revealed different information in the moonlight or in one of the moons for the setting. And yeah, and there was the Duke of that setting. He had ambitions to become sort of a regional power of his own amongst his ethnicity. So he wanted to copy this map. There were a bunch of other people who wanted this map for various reasons. Including the Seekers, because it turns out that on this map there are buildings in it that are distinctly Iosan in design, like Elvish in design, and it makes no sense because the elves don't, like, that's not part of the Elven homeland. So why would they be there, and blah blah blah. So so there was some baked-in mysteries there, but then there were also rival different houses that were going to be on there. So the guys were going to be, once they got past the initial thing and all met each other through this crazy map and crazy shit happened to everybody, they all got sort of hired as wardens or sheriffs for Blackacre, and that's what they were going to do. So the session I want to talk about, it was actually from the trip that was up there. I played this like a lot of other sandbox games where we did day to day to day. So every day of travel was sort of covered. Every place they stayed was an opportunity to role play. And as with many of my games, I had a sort of initial plan of like, oh, this will just be, they'll get up there. And I had this plan of the ruins that they were going to find up there and blah, blah, blah. 2.5 years of gameplay, we didn't even get close to the camp, to the adventure that I actually thought we would do within the first like month or two. So so anyway, this is what the sort of overarching setup was. And then the guys ended up just really enjoying dealing with sort of the NPCs and whatnot, and pursuing their characters' own sort of interests, right? Like they had a really great sense of who their characters were in the world and what they wanted. And each of the characters had they were unmoored, I guess, at the start of the campaign. And this, I set them up. I didn't plan this at all, but one of the payments they got was they got a tavern called the Queen's Carriage. And the Queen's Carriage became this real focal point for the players to build their life around. But I'm getting distracted here. Anyway, so that's the context. The guys are heading up to Blackacre. Along the way, they're escorting some religious folks, and then they're to meet up with another group, a group from one of the other noble families, and then they're going to escort them further into Blackacre, because in the Iron Kingdoms, the woods and the wildlands between the cities are really dangerous, dark and overgrown and whatever. So anyway, they're showing up at a place called Bisonhead. And Bisonhead is a town ruled by a guy named Graf Malko Yurik. And I sort of set up Malko Yurik as this grasping, greedy sort of guy who may be trying to ally himself with, like, he may be a traitor to the crown of Lael, because he may be allying himself with the folks, the neighboring Khador. For those familiar with or more familiar with the Iron Kingdom setting, in the storyline, or the official canon storyline, Khador ends up invading Lael and basically conquering almost all of it. This was set before that, so this was sort of, and some of my players knew what was going to happen. So there was this sort of doomed aspect to it, that they knew that this was going to happen, and they suspected that Yurik was going to be, one of the reasons, or one of the agents that Khador may work through to try and affect this invasion. But anyway, they show up, and the Seeker, they meet Yurik, and Graf Yurik is the is very much the snide, grasping, too big for his britches kind of guy, noble that you would expect. So the characters disliked him pretty intensely, just because he was an unlikable guy and smarmy and whatever. But one of his minions was a guy named Sir Alexei Makita, who was also known as the Magpie Knight. Now, the Magpie Knight was honestly he was, before I really got into Game of Thrones all that much, I just saw the character of the Hound in a couple of episodes, and I was like, oh, that's cool. I'm going to steal that idea, and we'll have him be the, being the bad guy. Having become more familiar with Game of Thrones afterwards, I think it's probably he's closer to the Mountain than he is the Hound, because there's no redeeming qualities about Sir Alexei, about the Magpie Knight. So what ended up happening is they meet the Magpie Knight, and while Yurik is putting on a face of sort of appeasing, because the players were agents of his liege lord, and the players are also tasked with collecting taxes from him. Graf Yurik owed his lord taxes, and that was going to be used to finance the payroll for the player characters. So they had to they had to work that out. And then in addition, the Seeker, the character who's playing the Iossan Seeker, found out that there was a elven criminal named Shael Rasil, who was a captive of Graf Yurik, who had passed some information through a contact. It was more information about these what appear to be elven style structures that are in there, something that was deepening the mystery. And the only thing that this criminal was able, or this person who's being held as a criminal was able to get out, was a little bit of a guide to go to this one cave where they found some etchings that helped flesh out more of that and provide more tantalizing sort of clues to follow about this mystery. So, but I mean, they assume that Shael must know more about this. So they go and they meet with Yurik, and Yurik keeps trying to obstruct them, and they keep insisting on getting access. And the cover for the Seeker, because Seekers do not act in the open, was that he was a bounty hunter. So he was saying that he was going to collect the bounty on this criminal, which I thought was a great idea. And it was, to be honest, unexpected. So what ended up happening is, when Yurik was finally pushed into a corner, Yurik then said, and was forced to sort of give up this prisoner. Graf then says, okay, well, Sir Alexei, go collect him. So he goes off, and Sir Alexei, the Magpie Knight, was exactly like the Mount Tooth, massive wall of humanity, wore heavy armor all the time. He was just, crush a man's head with his bare hands. And so the players are led out to this, and the keep was, he actually kept his prisoners, or these like special prisoners, at a prison, or a set of cells that were actually in this tower right near where his keep was. So they're led out there in the pouring rain, and as they approach the prison, Sir Alexei walks out and tosses down this body with the head caved in from the back. And he's killed Shael Rasil. And he says very tersely that he attacked him. And of course, again, like, Shael Rasil is this 5'5" or 5'6", elven man who's been suffering through deprivation of captivity, or deprivation while in captivity, versus this giant monster of a man. That's the moment where the characters really crystallize their hatred of Yurik and the Magpie Knight. And I know that that's the case because there was a later session where, I mean, they talked about the Magpie Knight, and they talked about Yurik, and he actually, when the characters needed to leave Bisenhead and continue further on, Sir Alexei rode at about a half-mile distance back, just following them up into the edge of the lands. And when the guys confronted him about it, he told them that it was his orders to see them safely to the edge of or to their borders, I should say. So that was a nice little way of twisting the knife on it. The characters, or the players, I should say, end up hating Sir Alexei so much that when he made an appearance again, when he was escorting another character through and one of the other noble family's children. They were escorting her through Blackacre, like the actual town itself. They hated him so much that they got into basically a big thing with all the players trying to stop one of the other players from murdering the Magpie Knight in his sleep, because he hated the character so much, and notwithstanding that there was going to be significant political ramifications, and it was great because I didn't have to intervene whatsoever. That was strictly the players of like, no, we can't do this because it'll be blah, 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 blah. We're playing into his hands. And the other player was just, fuck that, I hate this fucking guy, I want to kill him. So that one session, it was the one session where the Magpie Knight was introduced. It was something that I'd sort of, I had been watching, I can't remember what it was. I may have been watching some of the earlier episodes of Star Wars Clone Wars at the time. And the earlier episodes feature General Grievous a lot in it. And I just hate him. He's such a weasel in those early episodes, and he's so gloating and sort of dickish. And that I didn't enjoy them for how much I disliked Grievous in those, at least the first time I viewed it. And then I realized after a while, I'm like, well, this is what a villain's supposed to be. You're supposed to hate him. You're supposed to be just driven crazy by him, so that when you eventually defeat him and give him his comeuppance, it's so satisfying, because that's what happens in the series. And that's where I was when I was introducing the Magpie Knight. So that was one session. And it was hugely impactful because that character, I can bring up the Magpie Knight to this day with my players, and they just will spout off about him. That was all due to, I mean, he wasn't a recurring element. He appeared one other time in the course of the 2.5 years, but that one session was really impactful. So I guess if I want to tie a theme together from these three things, because I like trying to tie themes, I guess impactful sessions can be helpful if you're live to them for learning how better to run the game that you're actually running. As I did with 4th edition, I understood the game much better as a result of that session, and I didn't make the same mistakes that I made again, mechanically speaking, with that. After going through that experience, it can have an impact on the thrust of your campaign, which in my case ended up derailing the campaign, which in retrospect was unfortunate, because the characters really, the players really love the characters, and my players are terrific, so they were happy to go on to something different. But I could have handled that a lot better, and just sort of sat down and said, listen, guys, this is what I thought the game was going to be about. Here's where I'm seeing this going now. Are you cool with that? And I think they all would have been. So that's good. That's something you could draw from an impactful session like that. Something that you feel as a DM is a negative impact. Maybe you can learn to just recognize it for what is happening, why you're feeling the way you are, and then rejig the campaign appropriately in response. Or it can be impactful in the sense of, NPCs that, because to be honest, like the Magpie Knight was not intended to be an ongoing thing, but when I say that I like letting my players smell the roses, the hope is, and this is a terrible, if I'm running with this metaphor, that the players, prick themselves in one of those thorns, because that shows me, you responded to that. I think I'm going to try and use that again. To be honest, the Magpie Knight, I had no intention of having him reappear, but knowing how much the characters hated him, I was like, ooh, I can't wait to see what happens when I reintroduce him. And boy, did I get payoff for that. So anyway, so that's my my answer to the question from today, which was, what was your most impactful RPG session? So I talked about 3 different ones, unfortunately a lot longer than I intended. And actually that ended up being I think maybe that was, for me, more interesting to talk about than I had anticipated it being. So tomorrow's question is going to be, what is a good RPG to play for sessions of 2 hours or less? And that'll be interesting. I run my Wednesday sessions are usually 2-hour sessions, so that's that'll be interesting to think about that. And actually, those the Acquisitions Incorporated sessions, the live ones, are usually 2 hours or so as well. So that'll be those will be some good examples to think about between now and tomorrow. But anyway, if you have any, that was a bit of a rambling answer to one question I turned into 3 answers. If you have any questions or comments about the games I talked about, or about my lessons I'm drawing from those impactful sessions, please don't hesitate to leave a comment in the section below. I'll be happy to respond to those. Otherwise, I hope you're enjoying if you're watching this during the exercise, hope you're enjoying RPG A Day month for 2017, and hope to see you again tomorrow. See ya.